Hi, and welcome to part two of our series on history of halacha entitled Apart, Away, the Parting of the Ways Between Judaism and Christianity. This week we look at a few interesting statements from Chazal regarding Christianity, including the only time that the Christian Testament is quoted verbatim in the gemarah, by a Taanah no less. Then we explore whether or not a person or sect who have certain beliefs at the end of Bayit Sheni could have put them beyond the pale. What we find is a Judaism which, while not being very easy to join, was nearly impossible to be cast out of. This to me is really remarkable. Pre-Rambam Pharasaic or Rabbinic Judaism was extremely tolerant of a wide range of beliefs, or to put it another way, once you're in, you're in. That being the case, we will spend next time looking into historical rather than halachic factors that push Christianity outside of Judaism. Thanks so much for joining. Okay, welcome to part two of our series entitled A Way Apart, the Parting of the Ways Between Judaism and Christianity. So, I believe where we left off last time, let's just do a quick review. What did we say so far? Well, there's lots of Jewish groups, sects, denominations. I think denomination's the wrong word. It reminds me too much of different types of money. But the Jesus group was not hugely different from the other groups that existed at the time. The assumption that we have is that it was essentially a frum group, at least until Paul, maybe even after that. So that leaves us with our basic question, which is, when did the followers of Jesus stop being Jews? So I think last time we pointed out some of the different letters that we have from the first and second century, including the Justin Martyr's dialogue with Tryphon. We talked about that being Rabbi Tarfon, and I think I mentioned last time that we would try to see that inside. So just to read to you a little bit from the Tosefta. The Tosefta is in Shabbat, chapter 14, Mishnah Dalit, which says as follows: Hagilyonim v'sifrei minim ein matzilin osam mipnei hadleka. The Gilyonim, we're going to assume, is a reference to the evangelical writings. There are gemarahs that refer to it as Aven Gilyon or Avon Gilyon, but essentially the writings of the Christians and the Sifrei Minim, they are not saved mipnei hadleka, meaning on Shabbos, if there's a fire, we don't try to save those writings. Ela nisrafim bimkomam, we let them burn in their place. Hein azkarosehem, them, and even though they have names of God written in the Christian Testament, in whatever these documents of the minim and the Christians are, we don't worry about the fact that unfortunately the Shem Hashem is going to be burnt up because it was written by these minim and these heretics. Rabbi Yossi Haglili Omer Bechol Koder es azkarosehem v'gonzam. If, let's say, a fire happens during the week, so you can cut out the names of God and you bury them in gniza, v'sorf es ashar, and you can burn up the rest. Amar Rebbe Tarfon. So here we have Rebbe Tarfon, and what I was alluding to last time is that Trypho, who's dialoguing with Justin, could be a reference to Rebbe Tarfon, and here we see Rebbe Tarfon's very strong stance against the Jewish Christians. He says, "Kapach es bonai." This is a form of an oath that essentially I should bury my children. She'im yavo liyadai, that if these gilyonim, these sifrei minim, come to my hands, she'esrafam v'es azkaroseim shebahem, that I would burn them and their names of God with them. I think the implication is even during the week. Shafilu rodef acharai, even if a murderer were to chase after me, Nechnasti lebeis avodah zarah v'lo nechnasti lebatehem. I would rather run into the house of idolatry rather than to save myself, rather than to run into one of their batehem. The assumption here, I think, is a church or a place where the Christians are gathering. She'ovdei avodah zarah ein makirin oso v'kofrim bo, because the people who worship avodah zarah, they don't really recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu and deny him. V'halalu, but these, meaning the Christians, makirin, they recognize Judaism, they recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'kofrim bo, and they deny him. V'aleim amar kasav, and he applies the pasuk from Yeshayahu to them. So that is what we need, I think, from the Tosefta in Shabbos to see that Rabbi Tarfon did have a very strong stance against the Christians, and it is possible then that the dialogue between between Justin Martyr and Trypho is a dialogue with Rabbi Tarfon. The other thing that we sort of alluded to very obliquely, we were talking about the materials that are from Chazal that would reference Christianity or the halachic um, definition of whether or not Christians are Jews. And we mentioned that there's very scant material in the Mishnah, maybe some more in the Tosefta, and perhaps other Tanaitic material like Megillas Taanah would be appropriate over here. There is in the Scolion of Megillas Taanah for the 24th of Av something that I'd like to explore a little bit more. So Megillas Taanah is a work that dates from the time of the Tanaim. The Scolion is essentially an explanation or addendums to the material from Megillas Taanah, which dates a little bit later. I think the dating to the period of the Gaonim is a little bit off. It might be a little bit earlier than that, but essentially it's an explanation for some of the material found in Megillas Taanah. We're going to explore, I guess, what it says for the 24th of Av, although really it's also a gemarah and Baba Basra. Maybe we'll do the gemarah and Baba Basra instead. So the gemarahs and Baba Basra, Daf Kuf Tes Vav Amud Aleph, there's a Mishnah there that's talking about the order of inheritance. Seder Nachlos Kachu, Ish Ki Amusu Ben Ein Lo, Vartem Es Nachlaso Lebito, Ben Kodom Labat. The son comes before the daughter in terms of inheritance, says the Mishnah. Kol Yotzei Yerecho Shel Ben Kodmin Labas. So this is the point of contention over here. It teaches us that all the descendants of a son precede the daughter, and then a daughter precedes the brothers of the father who died, and even the descendants of the daughter precede her uncles essentially. So anyone who has precedence in inheriting, says the Gemara, their children also have precedence in inheriting. Fine. Tanarabanan, ben ainli ela ben, ben haben, o bas haben, o ben habas. O ben bas haben minayan, Talmud lomar, ein lo ein lo. So you have to investigate further generations in order to determine who is the actual inheritor. Bas ainli ela bas, bas habas, o ben habas, o bas ben habas minayan, Talmud lomar, ein lo again ein lo. So the Gemara continues. Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, Kol HaOmer Tirash Bas Im Bas Haben Afilu Nasi Shebisrael Ein Shomin Lo. So this is Rav Huna says that Rav says with regard to anyone who says that a daughter of the deceased should inherit the estate of her father along with the daughter of the son of the deceased, even if he is a Nasi Shebisrael, a prince of the Jewish people, you shouldn't listen to him. Why? Ein Shomin Lo She'einan Ela Maisid Sadokim, because this is the opinion of the Sadducees, the Tzedukim. The Taanah, because we learned Arba Ve'esrim B'Teves on the 24th of Teves. I know we mentioned it's in the Megillas Taanah for Av, but here we have the 24th of Teves. Tavna Ledinana, that the judgment reverted back to us, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. Shahid Tzedukim Omrim Tirash Habas Im Bas Haben. So on the 24th of Teves, we return to our law, meaning the halacha was reestablished in accordance with the opinion of the Pharisees, the Chachamim, after having been dictated by the Tzedukim. So the halacha, essentially what the Gemara is saying over here is that the halacha had been in accordance with the Tzedukim. What did the Tzedukim say? A daughter should not inherit the estate of her father along with the daughter of the son of the deceased. So but then Chazal on the 24th of Teves reverted the halacha to be like them. So here, just for clarity's sake and to summarize, the question that we have before us is whether or not the daughter inherits with the sons or the children of the sons along with the daughter. The question essentially boils down to who takes precedence in the laws of inheritance. And we see a discrepancy between the approach of the Pharisees and Chazal and that of the Tzedukim. That, bearing all of that in mind, we can now look at a gemarah in Shabbos on 116, the end of 116a, going into Amud Beis. And we get the following fascinating story, which, to my knowledge, is the only time that the Christian Testament is actually quoted directly in the Gemarah. So here, just to situate us timing-wise, we're dealing with Tanoim, or even really time in the times of the Pharisees, because we're dealing with Reb Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer. So Ima Shalom, there's this woman whose name is Ima Shalom, the Bisu de Rabbi Eliezer. She was the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, and Achse de Reb Gamliel. She is also the sister of Rabban Gamliel. Havahahu philosopha b'shivivuse tehaveshakil shma de lo mekabel shchuda. So there is a philosopha, as Rashi says, a philosopher, and it's going to become clear to us that this is someone who is a follower of Jesus, and they are in the same neighborhood, and this philosopher has a reputation that he doesn't accept bribery. Now they're going to call that reputation into question. They wanted to make a mockery of him and essentially show him up that this reputation is undeserved. So she privately gives him this gold lamp, and then she goes before him for a judgment. Amrale, she says to him, Be'ena de nifleguli benichse de benashai. I want to share in the inheritance of my father's estate. Right? Essentially, the question here is, does the daughter inherit with the sons? Amar Lahu. So he says to her and her brother Reb Gamliel, Palugu, the two of you should divide the inheritance equally. Amar Le. So Reb Gamliel says to him, Ksivlon, it says in the Torah, b'makom barasa lo tiros, right? In a situation where there is a son, the daughter does not inherit. Okay? Amar Le min yoma de galisun me'arachon, isnetilas oraisa de Moshe visehivas avon gilion. So from the time that you were exiled from the land, the Torah of Moshe was taken away, and avon gilion, that's what we mentioned before, the evangelion, the gospel is now in its place. Uksiv Bey, and it says in the avon gilion, bara uberasa kechada yarsun, that a son and a daughter shall inherit alike. Now, I will just mention as an aside to all of this aside that nowhere in the Christian Testament does it say such a thing. So this, I think, even adds to the mockery that's going on with this judge. But essentially, she bribed the judge. He provided the verdict that she was looking for, and he justified it based on the Christian Testament's teachings. Lamachar hadal ayole ihu chamra luva. So the next day, Reb Gamliel goes and bribes this philosopher with a Libyan donkey, which I guess is some kind of fancy or rare animal, and worth more than the lamp that she offered. Amar lahu shefilas l'seifa da avon. So Reb Gamliel, who apparently knows the Christian Testament, says, you have to make sure you read all the way till the end, because at the end of the Christian Testament it says, "Uksiv be'ana lo lemifchas min oraisa de Moshe asise v'lo le'osofe al oraisa de Moshe asise." So this is straight from Matthew. I didn't come to subtract from the Torah of Moshe, and I did not come to add from the Torah of Moshe. And like I said, in the Torah, it says that where there is a son, the daughter doesn't inherit. Amra le, Nahor. So I guess the assumption is that the judge paskin for Gamliel, and so the Ima Shalom doesn't like that. So Amra le Nahorayich Kishraga. Amar le Reb Gamliel asa chamra uvatash lishraga. So she says to him, "May your light shine like a lamp," because she's now outing him. She's alluding to the lamp that she gave as a bribe. And Reb Gamliel said to him, the donkey came and kicked over the lamp, and that's why the psak was in my favor. And so they revealed that, in fact, this Christian judge was taking bribes and was not deserving of his reputation. But from here, you see that this question of priority of inheritance was in discussion first among the Tzaddokim, and also was referenced by this Christian judge, and what it was the topic specifically that was picked by Reb Gamliel and his sister to bring to court in order to reveal to everybody that the Christians are not aware of the correct psak halacha, and that they are subject to bribery in order to reveal that to everybody else. Okay, now let's go back to our question for this episode, which is really boils down to: do we passel people based on belief? So again, we've tried to situate Jesus and his followers, and even through the times of Paul, as people who maybe had some beliefs that were, we'll say, leaning towards antinomianism, but are they? Does such a thing? Does belief that is outside the bounds of rabbinic Judaism, does that translate into people who are of that belief now being considered not Jewish? Now, lest you think that maybe there's some precedent for writing people out of the Jewish story based on heretical beliefs. Let's try to test that. So first of all, we have the Tzaddukim, the Sadducees. We're told that their wine is not kosher, maybe their kids are mamzerim, but really, I don't believe it's the case that they are, quote unquote, written out. Even if their beliefs are beyond the pale, as long as they're practicing common Judaism, standard Judaism, meaning they're keeping some form of Shabbos, some form of kashrus, they are Jews. Now, it's a little bit murky to even make these claims about the Tzaddukim, because, like the example I'm giving you, that their daughters, that their children are mamzerim, that's based on a Tosefta in Chulin, which makes a reference to minim. It's unclear. There's also a gemarah in Nida 33b. The Tosefta in Chulin is 221. The problem with this statement is that the Talmud was very heavily censored by Christian censors, and often the term notzri, or similar, non-believers, was replaced with min or tzadduki. So we can't be 100% sure that every place we have a reference to tzaddukim or minim, that it means exactly what it says. It could have been a censored reference to the Christians. That censoring happens around the year 1280, and the earliest full copy, at least, that we have of the Talmud is after that. There are fragments in the Cairo Geniza that I think are dated to like the 6th or 7th century, but we don't have a way to actually look at a fully uncensored, completely extant copy of the Talmud that predates the censorship. Even regarding the wine, I'm kind of extrapolating from Rambam's views of the Karaites. That's in his Tshuva 449. But I guess as an aside, just on the Tzaddukim in general, it's really remarkable to think that for most of the time the Bayit Sheni was in operation, the avoda, especially the avoda of Yom Kippur, the service that was done in the Beis Hamikdash, was done by or led by Kohanim who were Sadducees, who did not believe the same things that the average Pharisaic rabbinic Jew believed in terms of their basic theology. The reason to me that is so mind-boggling is that, as far as I know, Chazal never said, "Hey, don't go to the Beis Hamikdash. That's like out of bounds. The stuff that goes on there is done by a bunch of heathens, a bunch of people who, they don't believe in Tchias HaMesim, they don't believe in the Torah Shabbal Peh that we have." The Essenes essentially did that. They withdrew from the temple and said, that's not legit anymore. But Chazal never did that. They never made any comment that would cause kind of a splintering of our religion. Yeah, they were not happy with it. They did point out the errors of the Tzedukim there many times, where there is recorded in Chazal, in the Mishnah or the gemarah, where you have Tanaim that are arguing with the Tzedukim, but they didn't turn them into an other. They didn't make them into a guy. So you have people who don't believe in Torah Shabbal Peh, they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, and lots of other stuff, but we still count them for a minyan. If they gave your daughter a pruta and said Hareyat Mikudeshesli and she accepted it, she would need a bill of divorce, right? So that kind of tells you how far you can push things in terms of theology and still be kind of considered within the fold. And if you want, it really gets better or worse or crazier. I don't know how you want to look at it. When we consider that Chazal are even willing to treat the Samaritans, the Kutim, as quasi-Jews for certain things. This to me is really mind-boggling. These are people who don't even have the same Torah as us, but according to Masechtas Kutim, when their practices coincide with ours, we treat them as Jews. The Masechtas Kutim is one of the Masechtas Ketanos. There are these, you might have heard of Derech Eretz Rabbah and Derech Eretz Zuta. There are these collections mostly of the different statements throughout the Gemara that are kind of collated into a Masechta, and we'll call they get names like Kutim, Tefillin, etc. There is, I believe, some material there that's not found elsewhere in Chazal, but the bottom line is, if you look at Masechtas Kutim, Parak Beis, Mishnah Zion and Ches, you will see the list of what are the Kutim considered like Jews for, what are they not considered like Jews for, can you trust their shechita, can you eat their matzah on Pesach, etc. And there are many things for which we would not trust or allow a Jew to use something made by a guy or done by a guy, but if it's done by a kuti, we do rely on it and we treat it as if it's kosher, as if it's part of Yiddishkeit. In fact, the end of Masechtas Kedushim in Nasar Yochsin, where is it? Mishnah Parak Dalad Mishnah Gimel goes through a whole list of who can marry into who, and it treats the kutim as a type of Jew. Maybe low down on the caste system, but essentially still Jewish to a certain extent, and that's really remarkable. Again, the Kutim are the people who were brought in to replace the native population when the Jews were exiled by Assyria. They brought in these people who, at various points, they're described as Gerei Arayos. There's a whole story in the end of Sefer Malachim about this population transfer, but essentially these are Goyim. These are people who are brought in who are not Jewish in any way, shape, or form. They adopted some, but not all, of the practices of the Jews, especially because there was a need to survive, because the lions were attacking them. They resurface in Sefer Ezra. I would direct you to those classes on Sefer Ezra to learn more about them and how they kind of intermarried with the Kohanim and perhaps those are the forerunners of the Sadducees, whatever the case may be. The bottom line being that these are people who don't have Jewish ancestry. They have, if you look at the Samaritan Bible, if you will, there are significant changes just to the Chumash. Forget about the fact that they don't hold of the rest of Tanakh, certainly not the Torah Shabbal Peh. So these are people that, for all intents and purposes, are really off the reservation, and yet Chazal are willing to treat them to some extent as if they are within the Jewish nation. Okay, so let's try and see if we can get to some sort of approach for a solution. So can we put boundaries on our answers, on our answer? Well, let's start with, would you have eaten a Shabbos meal by an apostle? My guess is probably yes. So let's put it another way. If you were a follower of Jesus during his lifetime, you were halachically beyond the pale, yes or no? Probably not. You would still get an aliyah and shul. There is much scholarship and argument about what Jesus actually taught. I'm not going to claim to have read all the primary source material completely, and we are not in this year going to even think about resolving the contradictions between the Gospels. So instead, let's do our best case, worst case scenarios. At best, his message was essentially one to be hopeful about the imminent arrival of Mashiach, the Messianic kingdom, including a big emphasis on the intentionality of mitzvos as being at least as important, maybe more important than just rotely keeping halacha. That's best case. At worst, perhaps he did have personal messianic pretensions, And sure, he was annoyed at some of what the Pharisees said and did. However, that does not automatically make someone or that someone's adherents a heretic. Maybe it should, I don't know. But as long as they keep halacha and don't say that God told them to abrogate the mitzvos, that would come much later unless you are a follower of Chacham Fa'ur. He believes there's some secretive antinomian tendencies even in early Christianity, but we'll leave that to the side. I don't see why they wouldn't still be in the fold. Again, we're going to ignore things like John 1:14, and I would even say we're going to assume this whole Son of God thing, which appears in John, a few other Gospels, but it's really most pronounced in John a few times. We're not. There's no way that anybody at the time read or understood that to be read literally. I think Jews would have laughed at the notion of like Jesus being the actual Son of God. It really reeks of Greek mythology, like Zeus sleeping with a mortal woman and producing this kind of demigod. So, unless what I would suggest is that the whole thing is read metaphorically. And if you do that, then there's no real chiddush there, because the Torah often refers to Jews as sons or children of Hashem, Bonei matem Lashem Elokechem in Devarim 14:1 and plenty of other places. So putting all of that to the side, I don't see anything that puts them out of the fold. If we're going to divide Jesus's teachings into theological and practical, we could say that his theology doesn't really matter in terms of halacha, as long as it was broadly monotheistic and not directly antagonistic to Judaism, and that his halacha also doesn't matter as long as it was l'shem shamayim and not antinomian. In other words, Jesus is entitled to argue with the rabbis on points of halacha and its administration. Zeitlin has a whole essay on this. He's just not allowed to entirely abrogate halacha, which he didn't. Paul basically did over time. But speaking of Paul, it seems fair to say that even Paul isn't a complete min, because he continued to believe that Jews should keep halacha. His real innovation was that goyim can become Jews, or better yet, be saved without having to keep halacha. Just baptize, going to the mikveh, and circumcise your heart, which we said is um, doesn't involve any actual circumcision, and the true conversion um, involves circumcision of the flesh, but he sort of minimized that, and there's a whole discussion in the Gemara as to whether or not you need both aspects for conversion anyway. But P.S. Even if that makes him a heretic, he's still a Jew. In other words, his kedushin still takes effect. His kids would still be Jews. A Jew, even if he sins, is still a Jew. Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisrael hu. We just call him a Yisrael mummer or a min or a kofer, but this is kind of the whole thing. Not a guy, right? Maybe we'd even say that this person has no chelik in olam haba, he has no portion in the world to come, but still a Jew. Like, take your ideal min based on beliefs. A Spinoza, Mordechai Kaplan, and Elisha ben Abuya. Lamaisa, still a Yid, still a Jew. If so, then Christianity as a separate halachic category must necessarily start after the death of Jesus, i.e., later than 33, 36 of the Common Era. The fancy Latin way to say that is a terminus post quem, i.e., the earliest possible start date is after 36, versus the terminus ante quem, which is the last possible end time. To me, what is also shocking is that Chazal never even addressed this question systematically. Like, you would expect in Asar Yilchsin at the end of Kedushin that they could sneak in, hey, maybe don't marry the daughters of the Nazarene movement. But instead, the whole chapter focuses on a sort of case system with certain classes being of less, we'll call, desirable ancestry. But belief or even practice of Judaism doesn't even enter into it. Here again, the Sadducees are not mentioned either, because they were gone by the time the Mishnah is being written or compiled, or, and it's probably and or, because beliefs are not a determinant of Jewishness. That's, I think, really the crux. In fact, Rabbi Eli Fisher proposed to me on X/Twitter that the Sadducees would have likely not wanted to marry into Pharisaic families for fear of impugning their bloodline. So let's go back to our main question. There is essentially no mention of Christianity or Christians in the Mishnah, and only sporadic and incidental mentions in the Tosefta. We're not even going to touch the idea that there are parts of the Tosefta that are older than the Mishnah, what's known as Tosefta Atika. I would direct you to Robert Brody, who argues that, yes, there are some maybe older traditions, but by and large, the Tosefta we're still going to assume is after the Mishnah. And even in the Talmudim, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, we don't get enough material about Christianity to have any real halachic decision, which I think is surprising. Like, isn't it surprising that we don't really talk about Christianity in Masechtas Avodah Zarah? Why would that be? Again, to be fair, there were a bunch of mentions about Christianity that were expurgated, but hardly enough to qualify as a full treatment of the subject, given that often the Christian censors like Basil replaced references to Christians with terms like tzedukim, as we mentioned. So again, Chazal did not treat this topic in any meaningful way. Perhaps it's because the question didn't really need addressing, meaning it was clear to everybody that Christians, by the time the Mishnah rolls around, are goyim. Maybe. Um, maybe it was clear to all, or maybe there was a fear of addressing it. By the time, that Rome converts to Christianity in the 300s, the Jews are now in the minority and have been kicked out and oppressed, and this is not really the time to be making enemies. But whatever the case may be, we are left without a clear answer, I think, to our question because we're left without a clear halachic demarcation. Instead, what we're going to need to do, and I think we'll leave this for next time, is make inferences from major historical events um, that hopefully together can be compiled and add up to a good sense for when different communities or different parts of Yiddishkeit started to view Christians as no longer Jewish. So we'll leave that, I think, for next time. The takeaway here is that if we don't, well, let's do a little bit of Chazara. So we saw some interesting interactions from the Tanaim and non-rabbinic Jews. We talked about the order of Yerusha being a point of contention first among the Tzedukim and then among the Christians. We discussed the idea that we don't really passel the Samaritans, or even, and I guess this is important for me to mention, even the syncretists. Like this is a really, I guess it's a really fascinating point if you think about it. Even in Bayit Rishon, you have Jews who are syncretists, who believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but also worship Baal or Asherah or whatever the case may be. That's what the Navi is constantly railing about. These are people who needed to have some form of control over their world, and to them, having a God who I can't see, I can't touch, I have no directly way to connect to is great, maybe, but I need to know that I'm covering all my bases. So if you tell me, you know what, my kid is sick or the crop failed or whatever the case may be, if I dive into this avodah zara as well, it will allow me to gain some more control over my life and my livelihood. So who am I to count anybody out? And so by and large, what you're seeing even in Bayis Rishon is this idea of syncretism. And yet, none of those people are out of bounds and considered no longer Jews, right? So the Jew who goes to Shul, but then also goes to worship at the temple of Baal or Asherah, the Navi is talking to them as a Jew and saying to them, do teshuvah, come back. You're not beyond the pale. You are no longer, you're not considered a guy, even though you're doing what I would say is probably significantly worse than believing in Jesus, right? If you believed in Jesus as Mashiach, that's not avodah zara. It's not one of the the three main mitzvos that are Yarog Val Yavor. Um, so if you're able to hold syncretist beliefs and still be considered a Jew, then I think how much more so can we not turn Jewish Christians into non-Jews? Um, we know that it happened at some point, right? So we're still going to have to explore the historical events that led to it, rather than the halachic mandates which might have triggered the change. But I think it's safe to say that none of the beliefs are the trigger, could have been the trigger in the first and second centuries to change Christianity from being a part of Judaism to being wholly other and be considered goyim in terms of halacha. This is the end, beautiful friend. Thank you for joining us on our journey of learning, and I hope you will tune in for another episode soon, Mirz Hashem. Be well.